Good morning. Welcome. We've had a few guest lectures throughout the semester. Today is a particular honor for me and for the class. Professor Ellen Langer is or has changed the field of psychology more than any other person in the field. So 1,000 years from now, when our great-great-great-great-grandchildren will read the history of their great-great-great-grandparents and what they did, they will read about Professor Langer. It is a great honor to have Professor Langer here. Many of you know her studies. We discussed them throughout the class, and today she will share some of her most recent work from her book on becoming an artist. Thank you, Professor Langer.
Okay. Thank you, Tal. I don't know if 1,000 years from now people will still be reading, but the lovely introduction. What I want to ask you to do is play along with me. Okay, this is what we're going to do today. We'll play, then I'm going to persuade you, hopefully, of the costs and pervasiveness of mindlessness. And then, once I've gotten you scared about being mindless all the time, excuse me, what we're going to do is figure out how to protect ourselves. Okay, so first we play. What is this? Are we all playing? Okay, what is this? It's a cow. Okay, now this is the way the world is when we first meet it. We see, we have no idea what it is we're seeing, and at that point, it can turn out to be many, many different things. Then we come to know it. Sometimes somebody just labels it for us, or we, quote, figure it out, and we see it's a cow. The problem is that now it's almost impossible not to see the cow. Okay? Initially, again, it could have been many different things, and now it's reduced to this single thing. How much is 1 and 1? Okay, well, it turns out that 1 and 1 is 2 if you're using a base 10 number system. If you're using a base 2 number system, 1 and 1 is 10. If you add 1 watt of chewing gum to 1 watt of chewing gum, what do you get? 1. All right, now, the way we've learned almost everything about our worlds, ourselves, is through this mindless learning where we try to reduce uncertainty. We think we know it, we no longer have to pay attention to it, and the result is that we're frequently in error but rarely in doubt. Okay. What we want to do is learn how to stay open to subtleties. I mean, what is this? Yeah, but I've scared you already. We haven't even begun. Okay, this part of this, at least, is found in many of your intro psychology books. And you have, if I can show you here, I always hated these, but here you have a young woman, her eyes, her nose, her chin. Okay, and you also have an old woman. Here's her nose, her mouth, and her chin. And that's as far as it usually goes. However, here you also have a man. Here's his nose, and here's his mustache. All right, now, the only reason I'm showing you this is because when I talk about being trapped in a rigid perspective, which is what it means to be mindless, it doesn't matter if it's occupied by one or many things. Once we think we know it, we tend to ignore all the other ways it could be understood. In fact, is that a young woman or is it an old woman who's had a lot of plastic surgery? Is it an old woman or is it a woman who's lived a very mindless life? And is that a man or is it a woman in drag or what? We don't know. But we think we know. Now, I was at this horse event many years ago. And this person asked me if I'd watch his horse for him because he was going to get the horse a hot dog. Well, I said to myself in my best Harvardese, what is he kidding? Horses are herbivorous. They don't eat meat. And then he came back with the hot dog, and the horse ate it. And then I said, wait a second. Then I realized, well, doesn't it depend on how hungry the horse is, how big the horse is, how much grain had been mixed in with the meat in the horse's past and at the present? Okay, all of that gets lost in the facts that we take as unconditional truths. I was at a friend's house. She was making me dinner, and the fork was on the right side of the plate. I felt like some natural law had been violated, and I had to keep myself from taking the fork and putting it where it belongs. And I said, well, where did this come from? You know, the horses were herbivorous, that I got from school. Here, it was a simple case that at one time my mother said the horse goes on the horse and the fork go on the left side of the plate. Right? Even if I can generate many reasons why it would make sense for the fork to go on the right side, it still feels wrong. Once we lock ourselves in, it's very hard to find the key to unlock that. Now, I went to make a purchase. I gave the cashier my credit card. She saw it wasn't signed. She asked me to sign it. So I signed it. She ran it through the credit card machine, then gave me the credit card slip and asked me to sign it. I then signed it. And then she compared the two signatures. Now, it would be odd if they didn't match, having signed both of them in her presence. But then I thought about it, and this has become very important in understanding this concept. When you're mindless, you're not there in some very real way to know that you're not there. Right? And so then it became clear that I may be mindless just as frequently as anybody else, but I'm oblivious to it. And that's the problem, that if you want to change and get rid of this thing, you can't just decide it would be nice to do it. Because the moments it occurs to you to do it typically are the moments that you're not present. Oh, being in the present is something else that I find interesting. Everybody out there wants to be in the present. But nobody thinks they're not in the present. Right? That to be in the present, all you need to do is follow some of the simple things I'm going to suggest today, which is be mindful, and what that means is simply actively notice new things. But we'll get to that. We'll get to it right now. All right, when I'm talking about mindfulness, and this is mindfulness without meditation, we're simply talking about this active state of mind that results from actively noticing things. Doesn't matter if what you notice is smart, if it's silly, it just has to be new for you. When you notice new things, that puts you in the present, that makes you sensitive to context and perspective. Now, your behavior, when you're mindful, shouldn't be chaotic, and you can have your rules and routines, but your rules and routines should be guiding what you're doing, not overly determining what you do. The phenomenological experience of this mindfulness is the feeling of engagement, the feeling that people often envy when they see somebody else who seems to have a passion. You know, that I spend a lot of time, I walk around, and people not infrequently say to me, "Why are you smiling?" And for years I had been defensive, and I realized that the question should be, why aren't they smiling? That when one is mindful, you're actively engaged, you feel fully alive, and it's a very easy process to bring about. But most of the time we're mindless. Now we're trapped in a rigid perspective, relying on these distinctions and categories that we drew in the past. That means the past is going to overdetermine the present. Again, we're trapped in a single perspective. We're insensitive to context, and these rules and routines govern what we do. We just let it play out almost as if we're robots. And typically, this mindlessness comes about by default, not by design. But not always. I'm going to talk later about pretending, being inauthentic. And whenever we're inauthentic, what we're typically doing is deciding how to be based not on what's going on in the ongoing situation, but based on something from the past. So we take it from the past and say, this should work now, and then mindlessly enact that script. I'm going to argue that most, and I mean most, I probably even mean all, but that's a statement that's too big to make, of our suffering, no matter what it is, will have mindlessness behind it. And so for 30 years now, we've been doing research, study after study, where we teach people to be mindful. We take many different measures, and we find out that we get vast improvements in both physical and psychological well-being. Now, interestingly, if you think about it, no matter what you're doing, Whether you're taking notes, whether I'm giving a lecture, you're giving a lecture, playing a musical instrument, playing a sport, having a conversation, eating a sandwich, no matter what you're doing it either mindfully or mindlessly. And the consequences of engaging in this mindlessness are enormous. Here are just a few of the results we found over time now. Okay. When you get down to the alcoholism, allergies, and arthritis, ADD, I just realized this morning that they're all A's, which suggests a whole research program as I go through the rest of the alphabet. Okay, so now here is a thought that many people won't agree with, but I think can be persuaded over time. Now, I want to argue that mindfulness should be the baseline. This is the way you should feel all the time, not on rare moments. Okay, but the problem is, as I said before, that when you're mindless, you're not there to know you're mindless, so it's hard to figure out how to make that change. And that's what all this new work that I'm going to talk about is about. All right, what I think that will lead to an enormous increase in mindfulness for us as individuals, as a culture, and so on. See, if we all begin some new creative task, doesn't have to be creative, but I mean, in the arts or something. But the choice of the arts is because we tend to be a little less evaluative there. We begin take up pottery, photography, a new musical instrument. For me, it was painting. And just throw yourself in it. And the excitement you'll feel from that total engagement then tells you, this is how I'm supposed to feel. The moment you don't feel that way is the moment you have to change something in your lives. Okay, so in other words, we're fully there when we're mindful, we're not there when we're mindless, but in the transition from mindful to mindless, we're there to notice that if we take advantage of it, something in the situation should change. It's very easy for me to say, throw yourself into these new activities. But we don't throw ourselves into the new activities because of a list of roadblocks. And this is not an exhaustive list, just the ones that I talk about in the new book. And I'm going to go over a few of these. Clearly, there's not going to be time to deal with all of them. But I have research on each of them. So let's talk first about mindlessly faking it. So I'm going to argue that animals know. I'm just presuming that our pets know. Have you noticed that pets go towards some people, they stay away from others, that if you're in a bad mood, somehow the pet knows and leaves the room, especially during an argument. But that's just my experience with my pets. But dolphins, I have research. Okay, so we have trainers of dolphins. They're going to now be instructed to be mindful or mindless. When they're mindless, they're told, what we want you to do is think about all the things you know to be true about dolphins. And just repeat this information to yourself. Right? The mindful trainers are told, what we want you to do is think about how this particular dolphin that they're going to interact with is different from all the other dolphins, and how this dolphin is different today from the way he was the last time you interacted with him. Okay, so now we have the trainer in the water thinking mindfully, noticing new things, thinking mindlessly, relying on certainties from the past. The dolphin is released. We time how long it takes a dolphin to swim to the trainer and how long the dolphin stays. Okay. And clearly I wouldn't be telling you about this if we didn't find that they swam there faster and they stayed longer. Children know if we're mindless or mindful. There are lots of people, sadly, who stay in relationships for the children's sake and pretend thinking the children don't know. And the argument I'm going to make is that the children do know, and it's not good for them. Animals know, children know. So what we did was to have campers interviewed by people who were purportedly coaches from another camp. And the coaches were trained to be mindful or mindless. They're going to interview the child. Then we're going to have another interviewer come by and speak to the child to get a sense of what that last interaction felt like to him. Okay? When the interviewers were trained to be mindless, they were told, we want the children to like you, so we want the whole interview to be very positive. So pretend you're interested in what the child has to say. Right. When the coaches were trained to be mindful, they were told, we want the children to like you, we want the interview to be positive. We want you also to notice subtle changes in the child's behavior throughout the course of the interview, verbal and nonverbal behavior. And then they followed the same script, asked the same questions. Then, again, each of the children are interviewed by somebody else, and we ask them several different things. We don't have time to go through all of them now, but basically, we ask the child about how the child feels about himself, how he feels about the person who just interviewed him, how he feels about the camp. We assess his willingness to help other people, and so on. Many measures, all significant, all showing us that children are negatively affected by adult mindlessness. So they have to be noticing it in order to be affected by it. Adults know whether or not we're mindless. All right, now what we did was to have people who were going to be selling magazines door to door. And in the mindless condition, they read a script, they memorized the script, and then they were told, so go out and sell. And what we want you to do is practice it until you're really satisfied with your performance, and then give that performance repeatedly. The mindful group, also dealing with the same script, was told, learn it, but now make it new in very subtle ways that only you would know. They go out and sell. Somebody comes along after them to find out how the person they were selling to felt about them. And what do we find? That people who made it new in very subtle ways were seen as more charismatic. Okay? Animals, children, adults, everybody seems to know whether or not we're there, whether or not we're being genuine. The next question was asking, is it even visible in the things that we do? Oh, let me see, I have to take my lead now from the slide. This is a class in leadership, so let me tell you another study in leadership. First, I think it's probably clear to you how being mindful now leads you to be perceived as charismatic, so that in and of itself speaks in important ways to effective leadership. To my mind, charisma is probably the most important factor with respect to who we're going to follow. But there is a special problem that Christine Kawakami pointed out to me years ago when she was a senior here, which is a special problem women have. Now, when women who are not typically the leaders, and when women assume leadership positions and they decide, well, they'll act like men, they're disparaged. If they act like women, they're not taken seriously. So the problem is what to do to have women as leaders. And so what we did was we ran a study where we taught these women, regardless of their leadership styles, to be mindful or mindless, which was equivalent to the way they were doing it before. And we found that those who were trained to be mindful were considered more genuine, they were liked more, trusted more, and again, considered more charismatic. And now it starts to get really interesting for me. And the question is that, okay, people know whether or not we're mindful. Is it also visible somehow in the things that we produce? Now, let me tell you how I got to this. So not that long ago, I started painting. Now, I had to do this mindfully. I couldn't mindlessly follow rules because I didn't know any. All right, so I make this painting, and I loved it. Some other people also seemed to like it. I said, well, what's going on here? I mean, it's a dog, but there's nothing accurate about it. All I knew was that I put my entire self into it and had a fabulous time while I was painting it. And the question was, somehow, was that visible? Just give you a little chance to see the fun I've had with this. Okay, it's a Greyhound bus. Okay, maybe just one more. Do you know the Shar-Pei, the wrinkle dog? So this is before and after surgery. Okay, now the question was, was the mindfulness in the eye of the beholder, or was it actually on the canvas in some way? There you see he's muscular in the mirror, although not in life. Picasso said, "Each time I undertake to paint a picture, I have a sensation of leaping into space. I never know whether I shall fall on my feet." And that's something very important because we're afraid often to allow ourselves to be in the present, to be mindful and not mindlessly follow a script because we don't know where it's going to take us. But that's the reason that we want to do it, because when we don't know exactly what we're going to do, the experience of figuring that out is what is psychologically and physically enlivening. So can people tell if art is mindfully or mindlessly executed? So to give you an example of a study, very simple, we have people draw, copy it again. Versus draw, copy it, this time, copy it again, but this time, make it new in very subtle ways that only you would know. They do so. We then take all these drawings and we show them to, mix them all up, we show them to people and to find out what their preference is. And overwhelmingly, they prefer the mindfully executed drawings. And the people who made them prefer that. Can you hear it in music? What we did was to take several orchestras, and now orchestras are playing typically the same pieces over and over again, which is a prime candidate for mindlessness. So what we do is we have them take these pieces, and we say, okay, what we want you to do is remember a very satisfying performance you gave of this, and then just replicate that. Versus they're told, we want you to play this piece, but now make it new in very subtle ways that only you would know. Now, it's very important to have run this study because we finally can be sure that the differences that people were noticing, creating, were subtle. This was classical music. They weren't playing jazz. Also interesting was that the instruction is given individually, and the question is, what is the final performance, the group effort, going to sound like? All right, well, what we did was after they played in these two different ways, we asked them how much they enjoyed their performances, and they overwhelmingly preferred playing it in this mindful way. We recorded the performances and played them for people who were sophisticated in music, and again, overwhelmingly, they prefer the mindfully played piece. Can people see it in written work? Well, you know the answer is going to be yes, but I'm going to show you that when I talk about mistakes. Okay, so the conclusion so far is that mindfulness is visible to other people, it's even visible to animals, it's visible in the things that we do. So it doesn't make much sense for us to continue pretending. Okay. Now, one of the roadblocks that keep us from this mindful creativity, it's good for us to do, it's enlivening, what we do better, but still we're often hesitant to engage our mindfulness. Partially this is because of our fear of negative evaluation. And it's interesting, we pay lip service to the idea that everything cuts both ways. Everything has good things and bad things about it. But what we really mean by this is that, it might have 6 bad things and 3 good things, which then renders it bad. Right? What I'm suggesting is that the very same thing is simultaneously good and bad, and it's in the mind of the observer, not in the thing being evaluated. Okay, so imagine a company, what they're going to do is they want to produce a glue. So they put in lots of resources, they have a lot of ego involved in this, and then they find, lo and behold, the glue fails to adhere. Now that's terrible, right? Terrible failure. Until they thought to make it Post-it notes, all right? The very success of which depends on its failure to adhere. These other people created this defogger to save the crops in Florida. So they spray the crops in Florida, and instead of saving the plants, what happened is it produced an icy, snowy substance that ended up killing the plants. Terrible failure. Somebody else took the very same device, a machine, and use it now to create snow for skiers when the weather doesn't cooperate. Is it a success or failure? Well, it depends on the context. Now, if I asked you, do you want to meet my friend Tal? He's very impulsive. Why would you say yes? But I say, do you want to meet my friend Tal? He's very spontaneous. Well, then surely you'd want to say yes. I said, do you want to meet my friend Tal? He's so predictable that some could see it as boring. Do you want to meet my friend Tal? He's so stable, the kind of guy you can count on, and so on. All of our evaluations cut in these different ways. So it makes no sense to be afraid of engaging where we're going to be, where somebody is going to use some negative evaluation. Also, evaluations are made typically in the service of the evaluator, not really as a result of that which is being evaluated. That's for talk at another time. This is the one that I want to focus on today. The fear of making mistakes. This is why most people will think twice about beginning some new task, especially you, right? That even though you're in the years where you're supposed to be learning new things, you're already so successful that to try something new could only have the effect, it would seem, of bringing you down, right, if you're already on top. Now, mistakes are kind of interesting. So I live two lives. I paint and enjoy myself fully. Then I stand back as a psychologist and I try to understand what's going on. I do some studies to see if it's true just for me or there are some general truths. So I'm painting this painting. I dip the paintbrush into that ochre color. That's what I think I'm doing. In fact, I dipped it into magenta. As soon as I paint, I realize, oh my goodness, I used the wrong color. Now, my reaction was crazy. What difference did it make? I had only made the decision moments before, but still it felt again very wrong. Now, there's some general principles about decision making there. In order for something to be a decision, it means there's uncertainty. The moment we make the decision, we react as if this is the only way it could be. All that uncertainty is forgotten, and we get locked in. Okay, so I see I used the wrong color. I reach for a paper towel. I start rubbing it out. Now I notice, gee, I like them even more now than I did before. Now that's kind of interesting. What's going on? Okay, so then it occurred to me that a mistake may actually be a cue to be in the present. Now think about it, that if the weather person says it's going to be 55 degrees today, and it turns out to be 60 degrees, he's wrong. If the weather person says it's going to be about 55 degrees today, and it turns out to be 60 degrees, she's not wrong. All right? That the more rigid our plan, the easier it is for us to make an error. Also, that what I did here, that seemed to have some general principle behind it, was rather, because I was there and noticed that I liked it even more, I then went forward. Well, now, if you make a mistake and you go forward rather than go backward, you can't mindlessly follow the plan, because the plan probably didn't include this this particular mistake. All right, so then you're going to take your cues from the ongoing situation and presumably end up with something that's better. Okay. Now, another thing is that mistakes also often add interest to the things that we're doing. And I was thinking about man-made versus machine-made rugs. Man-made rugs are much, much more valuable. And the difference between the two is primarily errors. Just think of the regularity. You have, let's say, A, B, A, B, A, B, and you could fall asleep easily. Whereas if it were A, B, A, B, C, A, B, D, A, B, those off letters being errors that draw the viewer in. So we don't want to get rid of these mistakes necessarily, and certainly not so quickly. Okay, so if we incorporate the mistake, that'll lead us to mindfully attend to whatever it is we're doing, and the results, as the other research has shown, should result in improved products. So is this true? Okay, so now we do two studies. A study that people are going to be drawing, and a study where people are going to be writing essays. Three groups. The group that's not going to make any mistake, and then two groups that we're going to force to make mistakes. One of these groups we're going to say, if you make a mistake, forgive yourself, it's human to err. The other group, the important group, is going to be told, if you make a mistake, don't go backwards, go forward and incorporate the mistake into what you're doing. Okay, so the procedure is they're given these instructions to forgive themselves in advance if they make a mistake or to incorporate. Then we ask everybody to list what they had for breakfast. Now they're told we want them to write or draw about morning. So they start writing or drawing about morning. Halfway through, we give them a questionnaire that says, we know how difficult it is to think about morning. And now morning is spelled M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. So by asking them what they had for breakfast, we're priming AM. And now they see, oh my goodness, it was supposed to be grief and loss that they were supposed to be drawing about. They continue. We then find out afterwards how much they enjoyed it. We show the drawings and the essays to other people. And again, what we find is that those that were mindfully enacted, those that incorporated the mistake and went forward, those that used the mistake as a cue to be mindful, ended up being evaluated. Their essays and drawings were preferred. They were seen as more creative, more fluid, more of whatever it is we asked. Okay? That LMS is the Langer Mindfulness Scale that seems to, not surprisingly, I guess, be correlated with creativity. Now, Confucius said, being ashamed of one's errors turns them into crimes. John Cage, an error is simply a failure to adjust immediately from a preconception to an actuality. Both similar thoughts to what I've just said. And another roadblock is the rule of absolutes. We take information in like it is a cow, the fork goes over here, 1 and 1 is 2, freeze our understanding. And in doing so, we give up a great deal of control. If I said to you, or let's say you see a sign, and the sign says, keep off the grass. What most people do is they keep off the grass. Now contrast that with a sign that says, Ellen says, keep off the grass. Now you'd say, who is this Ellen? Maybe she doesn't live here anymore. Maybe I can negotiate with her. Right? The world that we experience is almost fully socially constructed. By taking people out of the equation, we forget that these were, whatever it is we're interacting with, whether to have this kind of a table here, this kind of a microphone, to have me here, and so on, that these were decisions. Decisions, again, require uncertainty for them to be decisions. All of that is hidden from us, and so it then leaves us in a position where it's hard to deviate. So, for instance, I go into an art supply store and I see, 100 different kinds of paintbrushes. Well, that can be very intimidating. And then you read the instructions on them and they say, tell you how they should be used. Now it's even more intimidating. Each thing I look at, I notice how little I know, and I'm afraid to begin. But then I step back and I say, who said so? Where does this come from? It was just people like me who painted and said, oh, it works in this way or that way. Some of it is just common sense that if you have a giant canvas and you're starting with a little paintbrush, could be interesting, but it's going to take you a long time to complete it. And if you have a tiny canvas, using a very large paintbrush. But these were decisions. Okay, so once you put people back into the equation, turns out that it's easier for us to deviate from what these norms are suggesting. Okay, so Adam Grant and I did some research on this when he was a student here. The first study, very simple. People are going to take a test. They're going to be given 10 questions, and then it's rigged so they're going to succeed or fail, where the success groups do uniformly well, but let's consider the failure. What they're told is they're given 10 questions. Now, they're just given the 10 questions, or they're told these 10 questions have been selected from 200 questions. Or they're told these 10 questions have been selected from 200 questions by 8 people at the Miller Testing Agency. Or these 10 questions have been selected by the Miller Testing Agency. So we introduce people in 2 ways. It's a small group of questions culled from a much larger set, must be by people, and they're either told that it was done by people or not. Both of these are ridiculous. Both of these treatments, if you think about it. Whatever questions you're asked, there always are a larger set of possible questions you could have been asked. And who's doing the choosing? Obviously, people. So it shouldn't have any effect, yet it did have a very big effect. It turned out that when we put people back in the equation, when we made the fact that this was all a social construction salient to people, then when they failed, they were able to cope much better with the failure. Okay, they noticed that they didn't do well, but they were anything but devastated by it. I'll give you another example. You're in a hospital. You're on a bedpan. You're very uncomfortable. Now, in one case, we say your nurse is someplace else. There's another nurse right outside the door who's busy doing some work. Do you interrupt her? And if so, how long do you wait? Versus, your nurse, Betty Johnson, is busy elsewhere. There's another nurse, and notice that other nurse still isn't named, who's right outside your door, so on and so forth. Well, as soon as we take this role, nurse, and we inhabit it with a person, what happens is people are much more likely to meet their own needs. Do you understand what I'm suggesting here? That if I wanted to persuade people to leave things just as it is, what I would do is take away from them any notion that this was created by people. You want to have a sense that things can be other than they are. You're looking to paint, for example. You don't have a canvas. If you buy into this silly stuff that the only thing you can paint on is something you buy in an art supply store, then you clearly can't paint. But you turn around and you have napkins, paper towels, you have shoe boxes, you have whatever in your house, which would easily serve as something on which one could paint. Okay, once you realize that the world is a social construction, it's easier to reconstruct it so that it works better for you. I don't have time to talk to you about social comparisons, but this is the way we often keep ourselves miserable and in place and afraid to exercise our mindful creativity. We evaluate ourselves in contrast to somebody else. And all of these evaluations are mindless. We don't pay attention to what the dimension is. If I say you're better at tennis than I am, what does that mean? Does that mean you have better ground strokes, you're faster, you have a better serve? What does it mean? We don't pay attention to the particulars of the performance. Is this my very best performance and perhaps your weakest? Because the social comparison then wouldn't be very good to predict what's going to happen next, and so on. Okay, if you want to read more about that and see it discussed in a new book. An interesting quick finding is that whether you see yourselves as better or worse than other people, we find that the more likely it is that you make these social comparisons, the more likely you're going to experience guilt, envy, defensiveness, regret, blame, and have unmet cravings. Okay, all of these rely on evaluations. The less evaluative you are, the less you should experience any of this. Okay, so now I paint this picture. A friend of mine who knows that I'm at least of average intelligence. He knows that I used to have horses. He's an educated person. He sees this and he says, Ellen, horses can't do that with their back legs. Okay. Now, if he saw it hanging in a gallery, chances are he'd assume it was intentional and he'd approach it differently. Now, contrast that. A different friend. Now, you can't see this so well in the painting, but in the slide, but in the painting, the white dog, as she explained to me, the white dog's windows are not nearly as clean as the black dog's. Now, she sees this painting in a gallery, and she says to me, Ellen, isn't that the way it is? And I said, isn't what the way it is? And she said that, the white dog is center stage. He's not doing as good a job as the black dog. The white dog even has his own food bowl. And she made a whole political statement out of this. All right, now consider these two people, these two friends. Who is better off? Okay, because in neither case was what they were attributing to the paintings relevant to me as the painter. All right, now, we've done studies, many studies. Let's just talk. We have women who don't like football. They're going to be watching the Super Bowl. People who don't like rap music are going to be listening to rap music. People who don't like classical music are going to be listening to classical music, and so on. And what we do is have them just look at it or listen, or they're instructed, notice one new thing about it. Notice 3 new things about it. Notice 6 new things about it. That's all we're asking them to do. It doesn't matter if what they notice is smart or silly, just that it's new for them. And what we find is the more they notice, the more they like the thing that they've noticed. And when Stephen Long was a student here, he did this study where he had chocolate that was wrapped in Godiva chocolate wrapping or an inexpensive candy wrapper. So we have it was Godiva or inexpensive chocolate wrapped in Godiva or wrapped as if it was inexpensive. And people ate it and then evaluated it. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that when they thought they were eating Godiva, they liked it more. You get a halo effect even for chocolate. But what was interesting is that when they thought it was Godiva, they spent more time tasting it. In that more time, the more noticing of it, you make things interesting to you. As you actively notice things, that's the essence of engagement. Okay? Now, it's interesting because people say about their work, about their long-term relationships, you're too young to have very long-term relationships. If you look at your parents and your parents' friends and so on, that people believe things have to get old. They have to get boring. When I first met you, it was so exciting, and now it's the same old, same old. All right, I think about that, and it occurred to me, how old are you? Let's say you're all over 18, right? That have any of your parents said, I've known you for 18 years, and at this point, you're really starting to bore me. Okay, and we don't even do that with our plants. What's the difference between plants and children from our jobs and long-term relationships? The difference is that when you have children, when you have plants, you expect them to change. You expect them to grow. So when we look for those changes, and there are always changes, what happens is we end up liking the thing that the target of our attention. There's a research literature on mere exposure effect. And I don't know if you know it, but it's the more times you see something, the more you like it. We'd have to amend that a little bit. The more you actively engage it, the more you're going to like it. It's boring, it's just water. Okay? The Face of the Water in time became a wonderful book. A book that was a dead language to the uneducated passenger, but which told its mind to me without reserve, delivering its most cherished secrets as clearly as it uttered them with a voice. That's Mark Twain writing about water. Anything can be made interesting. Read this with me. Let me hear you. Okay, well, you're smart enough to know that there's something wrong, but still. Okay. Can you see what's wrong, with words on this poster? Okay. It's very hard to break out of this mindlessness. Now, we don't taste things because we think we know. We don't hear things because we think we know what it sounds like. We don't think exciting thoughts because we're trapped by some of the things that we learned before. So our mindless learning leads us to be stupid. Our mindless seeing You become so expert at seeing what you expect to see that we actually become blind. Dan Simon did an important study where he had people watching a videotape of a basketball game. In the middle of a videotape, somebody walked in who was wearing a gorilla suit. People didn't notice. This is true, just as many of you didn't notice the correct way of reading the slide before. What we did is we said to people, okay, we're going to show you a videotape of a basketball game. All basketball games are like all other basketball games, which is why we call them basketball games. And just as surely, each basketball game is different from every other basketball game. So we want you to pay attention to the ways it's the same and the ways it's different. Again, that should be an empty instruction. Those people saw the gorilla. Gertrude Stein, a rose is a rose is a rose. By learning the way all roses are alike, we run the risk of becoming blind to their differences. We tend to mindlessly accept absolutes and judge ourselves by criteria as if they are perspective-free. We pretend so as to meet these criteria. We fear making mistakes, etc., and hesitate to become mindfully engaged. Things are all the while changing, and noticing changes keeps us engaged. That famous painter, Ellen Langer, says, a rose is not a rose, is not a rose. Diane Arbus, famous photographer, said, my favorite thing is to go where I've never been. That still famous painter, Ellen Langer, says, right where we are is where we've never been. So some of the recent conclusions, I suggest you be authentic. Our mindlessness is visible, so you're not fooling anybody anyway. Mindful engagement is the essence of charisma. Don't assume we know it. Our mindsets are stable, and we confuse the stability of our mindsets with the stability of the underlying phenomenon. Things are changing. You want to hold it still, fine, but it's changing nonetheless. Social comparing is largely mindless. Criteria a person determined and so can be changed. And feeling engaged results from noticing, creating novel distinctions. Okay, so great fun awaits if we allow ourselves this kind of mindful engagement. I mean that seriously. It's easy. It's fun. All right? Which is nice because it's also good for us. So the penultimate conclusion, if we begin a new creative venture, we can come to know what mindfulness feels like. If we continue the activity, we will more generally increase our mindfulness. If we increase our mindfulness, we'll improve our psychological and physical well-being. And all the while we're doing this, whether we're at work or play, we're going to feel fully alive. Okay, so I suggest that what we want to do is begin a personal renaissance. I've told you the way I think that it can easily be done. And so let me end just by wishing you all more mindfulness. There's probably time for one or two questions, if anybody has any. Yes?
Was there any difference in magazine sales?
Yes, they sold more magazines, as you would expect. All right, well, yes?
One of the things we've learned in positive psychology is the power of habit making. And well, on one sense, like what the biggest habit of this, but when we have habits, we often
We never